right. I'm happy to say I was invited because I really got to know you guys and Tulsa and really appreciate the history of what you do up there. And meeting Amy was a real pleasure. And my goal today is to give you some perspectives from our company based in Houston, Texas, about what we're calling subsurface energy storage and a demonstration of that, first of its kind in the world, I'll talk about. And about also how we're opening the door to a new generation of geothermal in our minds, targeting tight rock. So this is an evolving story, and it starts with storage and goes towards geothermal. So I'll get started here and just give you just a brief mention about our company's leadership. I prior, as Amy mentioned, worked at ExxonMobil. Our executive management team is all Heritage Shell, and these are folks who I had heard of in part when I was at Exxon because they were instrumental in inventing managed pressure drilling, especially Lev Ring and Lance Cook during their time at Weatherford and Shell. That's a technology approach that has allowed the world to go deeper and into more challenging environments offshore. And now when these folks retired, they basically are taking their know-how and trying to apply it to tight rock geothermal problems. That's really the goal of what we're doing, is to really build a new type of industry around geothermal and also energy storage. So this is our history, if we will, in one timeline. Founded 2020. We initially had seed funding investment mainly from two kind of interesting bedfellows, Neighbors Drilling, largest land fleet in the world, and then also Viria, which is a climate change philanthropy. And so the two of them saw a lot of promise in our concepts and our patents initially. We have a bias to the field. We've spent, we raised about $55 million, and we spent about $50 million at least in the field working on wells. We took over a well in South Texas. I'll talk about that more, and demonstrated our energy storage concepts there around 2023. And then more recently, we have raised money and gone back and scaled that up to a full-scale commercial facility. So in our minds, that means about 3 megawatts capacity for energy storage. There's things we refer to as technology readiness levels, TRL. And so Sage's Technologies is about a 7 or an 8, depending on what we're looking at. But basically, we have these two business lines that I'll talk about: energy storage, which we've now demonstrated, and then the future, which is geothermal power generation or geothermal heat and energy generation. So we've secured funding from the U.S. Air Force to do some testing this year, which is great. We also, I'll mention in more detail, signed a contract with Meta, which is the Facebook parent company, to provide them power beginning in 2027 in a pilot scale, and then upscaling from that. So data center energy is a big story these days, and that's part of what I'm here to talk about. But basically, we're a company of oil and gas folks who are working hard to test technologies in the field that we think can make a difference to make things commercial for energy storage and geothermal. So these are the cartoon versions of our technologies. So basically, they share about 75% of the subsurface story. On the surface kits, things are a little bit different. We call the energy storage product Earth Store. It's kind of our generic name for energy storage, but basically we take the ability to store energy in high pressure environments subsurface, so very tight rock. My job at Sage is to help target where that is, and really a lot of our geoscience team spends time de-risking things, much like oil and gas does for drilling wells. And I'll provide you a summary of that. What we found is that we can put water into the ground using a pump. So you see on the left here, I'm looking at energy storage, the green pump. We inject into a very normal oil and gas style well. We inject into fairly normal oil and gas fractures, although we have a proprietary design with a heavy fluid, inert fluid, which ends up driving a fracture which has at least a vertical component, not just lateral. And we found that that allows us to have more efficiency as we open and close that fracture through time. The ability to take grid power, run a pump, push it into the ground, into a fracture that's maybe 5 millimeters by 2 square kilometers or so area underground, and then hold that pressure, because we're looking at very tight rock, allows us to then release the choke on the well, which is what you see in the production phase on the additional side. So it's this one well, 2 different timestamps. First it's injection phase, you hold it, and then when the client wants power, you release the choke. That rushes out at about 4,000 psi. That turns a turbine, very same type of turbine that you use for a lot of other types of hydropower, for example. And that has about a 75% round trip efficiency of the electricity generation. We've seen less than about 2% fluid losses in these operations, and that's good in our mind to secure the long-term efficiency of these things. So I've talked about demonstrations. We worked in Starr County, and we just built a plant in Atascosa County, or Atascosa. So I'll get more into it at the end of the talk, but the same technologies for putting water into the ground, into fractures, and then holding it, is something that we are pursuing to do even deeper into geothermally attractive depths. So maybe we're doing about 10,000 feet total vertical depth for the energy storage, and maybe starting in geothermal, depending where you are, targeting about 200 Celsius depths, which vary considerably around the world, but in many places could be in the West, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 feet, which is great. Or in Texas, might be starting to look more like 16,000 to 18,000 feet. So that's what we'll be focusing on, and we'll talk more about this later, but essentially it takes up a very traditional organic raking cycle turbine, binary cycle turbine, to recover the energy at the surface for power. We also have direct heat use cases we're running, for example, with the city of Romania and Bucharest. So I'll just take a step back, though, and talk a little about why we care about this. And part of that relates to the need for energy storage. So this graph shows the anticipated battery development that's been, is predicted, and that's kind of come to fruition in the United States. And also talking about the supply gap, which exists really between the durations of about 4 hours, let's say, to thousands of hours for any type of energy storage. And so you see batteries have a lot of really important efficiencies under maybe 4 or 5 hours, but longer duration energy storage is very challenging to do with just batteries. And so pump storage, which is putting water uphill in dams, that's taking most of the load, if you will, for humanity. But there's an opportunity really here, and we're trying to fill it. This 4 hour to 1,000 hour, and this may be 1 megawatt up to gigawatt scale. So I'm talking in power terms. I'm a geologist. It took me a while to get used to these things, but essentially we're talking about the ability to store pump storage hydro, but underground. So on the right, you have kind of a cartoon version of how most energy is stored today in the world, where more than 90% of the time in Texas and other places like Oklahoma and around the world, India, you pump water uphill, and when you need it to generate power, you release it, and that comes down to a turbine. And when you have excess power, like from a hot day or something, you pump the water back uphill. This is how Las Vegas works. They drop the level of Lake Mead 4 feet every night to make the city run. It's lights, things like that. Of course, you're limited by water availability, geography for mountainous areas, permitting timing, etc. What we've been doing now, and here's a reference that we put out, kind of a extended abstract explaining in more detail what I'm presenting today. But that same figure I showed earlier, where you're taking grid power, you're pumping it into the fractures underground, you're inflating them, and then you're releasing it at a later time and running a turbine, which is basically the same type as what you would use in a storage hydro dam. So it gives you a smaller footprint with even higher energy density, because you're targeting rocks that are more than 7,000 feet subsurface. So that's pretty exciting. And this is, again, another view of that cartoon I showed earlier. also just basically explaining how a single well works for mechanical energy storage. So like I said, you take the water from a pond, you take grid power, you pump it in, inflate the fracture. Very standard oil and gas type well. We're talking maybe at least 7 inches diameter. We've done testing in 9 to 5/8. And then at your later time, you allow Mother Nature to close that fracture, which she does with enormous pressure. Some people call it like a man-made geyser effect, really. And we've run tests now of multiple days even, running long duration. We see a sweet spot, though, for generating power in the 1 to 3 megawatt range per well to achieve a long outflow. I just want to give you a rough sense of what we have to do as geologists, though, to make this all possible. So this is kind of a step back and looking at some of the key risk elements, really. So I'm from oil and gas heritage, and this is very similar to what you would do for a prospect pre-drill analysis, really. On the right, you see an example of where we would operate these wells. So basically mostly vertical wells with a slight deviated tail or deviated to some degree, but allowing us to have a set of mainly vertically oriented fractures. We've done that in sedimentary rock now. We are hypothetically capable of doing that in igneous formations and metamorphics. We've not done that in the field yet, but looking at industry, which is rapidly developing around the new geothermal, there's a lot of potential that's being drilled right now in basement rocks. And actually, I've seen some great rocks even in Oklahoma, where this is all very, very possible, both these deep sedimentary and basement igneous. On the map view, you kind of see how we want to avoid major fault families. That's key. What we're looking at for energy storage and for geothermal power and storage are very similar. It's just we don't need heat to store energy underground as high pressure water. And in fact, it's simpler if it's only a single phase water and not any vapor. But we need a very tight rock. So, that's the hunting grounds for us, really. It's all that stuff that we like to think of as ceiling facies, maybe in oil and gas. We need to stay offset from major faults and fault families. We need to essentially have a thick overburden also to maintain seal. This is a differentiator from other companies. Some of our competitors are doing this type of operation, but at like 3,000 feet. In our view, that's unsustainable because you have too much leak off. I mentioned we're trying to keep fluid losses under 2%. So we can work in overpressure. That's fine. That gives us some confidence in sealing facies. And then basically, like I said, all of these things are what we would target in the same type of wells for geothermal, except we would go deeper to get to at least, I'd say, 150 Celsius, if not 200 or more. Of course, beyond that, it gets more challenging to drill and work with your production tools, but more heat is attractive for sure. So here's some data and kind of also a cartoon of the well from initial testing we did in 2022. And this just gives you a little bit more of a sense of how these things are built and what they operate like. So we've got the injection. Basically, it's a huff and puff well where you have perfs, you pump in, you inflate the frac, you end up opening the choke, having flow back with high recovery of fluids. And what you see on the right is a time series of pressures at this type of operational scale. These were 2 different pad sizes. So the time in gray and the time in yellow, we used 2 different volumes that we emplaced. But basically, we would bring the frac closed, pressure would drop. Frac open, pressure would drop. We see a rush of the water out, and then we can re-inject. So we build pressure back up. We hold it. So we go above fracture opening pressure, but we stay well beneath, I would say, massive runaway fracture propagation pressures. And we work in this red box, if you will, of an operating window. Now this varies by location and rock type, and that's something that we have to initialize whenever we enter a new sedimentary environment, really, or igneous environment, whatever it will be. That's something we've now done in 2 different places. We've done it in the deep Yewa Vicksburg transition, mainly siltstone mudstones in Stark County, and now also in the Anacostia limestone sandstones of Atascosa County. But you see, we build pressure back up and we can hold it, and then we cycle. And so it's basically a huff and puff operation. We've run this type of operation now for weeks over different months since 2021. And we haven't seen things like near wellbore collapse or massive fines migration. We actually see a kind of a neutral effect on total dissolved solids through time using water that we use from the surface. We are overpressured we're slightly over compared to hydrostatic, and so we're not actually producing water from formation. It's if you will, we keep the whole system above hydrostatic. That's kind of an important point. And this is kind of what it looks like through time in 2 different experiments that we ran. So this is data from about a 30,000, 40,000 barrel emplacement of water, which is what you see in the blue here. So water comes in, pressure rises in black. I'm looking on the left-hand side here with the long duration set. The goal is to get a flat plateau of power production, which is what we achieved with this red line here. So in green, you have water that you use grid power to put in the ground, and that's the flow rates in. And then once you open the choke, flip it around to production, you're looking at the yellow, which is the outflow. And that's what creates the longer plateau. You have this interesting relationship where volume increases, flow rate out as pressure drops. And you can kind of see this sinusoidal pattern in the pressure. Now, the ends here are a little weird because we did a couple of tests that weren't related, but essentially we're taking this long duration view of this in the middle, but at least 16 hours. And that's very attractive because, like I mentioned with batteries, only being really commercial at about 4 hours or less, having an option to, say, use solar power to pump water in during an 8-hour solar day, and then during the evenings and the nighttime and the morning, run your well to produce water outflowing at a continuous rate is attractive. So that's also, on the right, you see another option where you release a huge amount of water very quickly, and you don't aim to get a plateau, you aim to get a spike. So kind of peaking, if you will. This could help replace like a gas peaker plant. If you had for example, a massive outage on your network and need to bring a huge amount of power on quickly and don't really care about the efficiency as much. I'll just bring up a use case too that's very important to Texas and Oklahoma, really, which is just the criticality of storage. On the right-hand side, we've got past historical curtailment of wind farms and percentage, and then also the percentage of the grid itself, which is composed of this type of renewables. So Texas and Oklahoma have the highest percentages in the country, United States, but you see these curtailment rising, which means that essentially all those investments are lost. They don't have any way to store the power that's being generated. So this opens an opportunity, we believe, to store that energy at the megawatt to gigawatt scale. Sage is working with a number of folks. We've got 4 different studies ongoing and operations ongoing with the Defense Department, and they are really interested in behind the wire energy security. Things that are hardened, subsurface is attractive to them, small footprints, and really energy security. Energy security is something we're hearing more and more about from diverse types of clients around the world, really. But the military has been very supportive, including Army, Navy, and Air Force. I mentioned how we have a commercial pilot. So this is a photo on the right. We just built this end of the 2024 into January this year. On the left, you have a kind of a cartoon version of what is actually there. So you've got a wellhead on the left. We drilled that well, I mentioned, down to about 9,000 feet into the Olmos at formation at those depths, very tight rock. And then we ended up connecting it with our pipelines to the Pelton turbine, which is sitting on top of a cement block, basically on top of a large pond, which contains about 60,000 barrels capacity of water. We've got like a 12-foot fence around it because the deer love to come drink and mate and stuff. Also the javelinas, they all love this water. This is out near just about an hour south of San Antonio. And so we're working with the San Miguel Electrical Co-op to operate this. And they are planning to scale it in the future to allow them to transition into more solar in their portfolio. I mentioned how they're concerned about storage because of that. So this is a use case where you would have a goal of selling or having 24/7 power at the 200 megawatt scale. And to do that, you would need, in our estimations, to overbuild the solar about 3 times to get a 24/7 continuous operation. So you build maybe 540 megawatts. That allows you to store, the equivalent of 200 megawatts underground in these earth store wells, and then to release it back to the surface, like I mentioned in the example of 16 hours during the nighttime in the shoulder seasons, and at maybe a 15 to 20 acre footprint. So this is what we're building in Texas. This is what we're scaling with different partners. This is a view of kind of how the economics might come down. This is blended with solar as well. So the idea is that you could see something like just shy of 7 cents for 8 hours of Earth Store solar, and maybe 2 cents for solar itself, giving you a CapEx blended of around 5 cents per kilowatt hour, which is pretty respectable comparative to other forms of energy storage and production. So we're excited about that. If we can compete in Texas, that's where we want to start, given our ability to rapidly move. But Oklahoma is very attractive for other reasons, like I mentioned, especially the wind. So a very similar use case exists for a wind storage case as well. And by the way, we don't rely on tax credits to be profitable. This is a little bit of a different view of the same story I mentioned about how we're working with San Miguel Electrical Co-op. I mentioned how their long-term goal is to replace and diversify their current portfolio. They're currently a coal plant. It's one of the last ones left in Texas, but they have this mandate to build 1 gigawatt of solar by 2030. And they're interested in augmenting that with storage and maybe even geothermal power. So this would help avoid closure of this plant and save, we think, at least 400 jobs. So we're really supportive of this, and really happy to be working with them on their leasehold. So I'll take a step back now and kind of think about it from a new perspective on geothermal itself. We hear a lot of talk about it. It's less than 1% of utility generation now. On the left is every single geothermal power plant that you've ever heard of, basically operating in the world, where you're targeting very, very highly permeable rocks, which naturally flow steam or water. You have a lot of work cut out for you to find these entities. Just talk to Ormat, which has an amazing exploration team, but the only publicly traded companies in geothermal. Production rates are very unpredictable. We did internal analysis of operations in Nevada and Turkey at Sage, and we saw something like 40% of wells fail within 5 years in this business. And that has led to a lot of failures of companies over the last 50 years. And so it has been a very high initial investment environment with very long payouts, with a lot of risk, and that has made it a very slow growing business. We are interested at Sage and other companies in trying to expand the envelope and bring hot, dry rock into this, which is what you see on the right. So targeting rock which is essentially tight, does not have extensive faults, and we're drilling for the hot temperatures rather than water production. So you see a couple of different styles of approaches. Sage is on the left, where we kind of have this huff and puff in and out of single wells, bringing the water back to the surface before it moves to the next well. We have other companies out there that are doing enhanced geothermal systems where they're bringing water down to laterals and communicating between wells in the subsurface with large fractures, like Fervo. They're doing that in Nevada and Utah. And you have folks like Ever who are working with a different type of closed loop system where they essentially drill long laterals. These are all kind of developing right now, and we are excited to be learning with the community about how and when these systems can become really commercial in more places in the world. So if we look a little bit more at Sage's perspective on this, I mentioned how we have a multi-well system for this particular approach for geothermal. We call it pressure geothermal, or geopressure geothermal systems is another approach. And I mentioned how the wells connect at the surface and not in the subsurface. So we're essentially inflating and deflating each well, but during the deflation phase, the water ends up going from one well through a heat exchanger to another well. So you don't have the pond that I was talking about for energy storage, but you do have the heat transfer through the water and through the heat exchanger into a binary cycle plant. Sage is separately trying to innovate around turbines at the surface. So we have a supercritical CO2 turbine that we've been developing with the Southwest Research Institute in Texas to make these systems even more efficient, even more commercial, chipping away at the commerciality challenge of geothermal bit by bit. So much like any binary cycle geothermal plant in the world, we have this additional heat exchanger and heat recovery system, which can generate power to the grid through the turbines. We can also use this working fluid in the subsurface working fluid for direct heat use applications also. So, I mentioned these companies in the past. I would be remiss if I didn't say that I think Sage has an advantage, mainly because we estimate higher power output using the pressure. We don't vent pressure to the surface. So, you spend a lot of energy pumping the water into the ground, and that's a parasitic load to your overall net energy production. So we need to account for that, and every institution that is trying to produce geothermal power needs to account for that. We see lower capex mainly because we don't drill long laterals, we don't have proppant, we save time on rigs. We also have, in our view, a more even fluid dispersion and lower friction. I mentioned not using proppant, so that's part of how we keep our efficiencies higher. And we think we also have a lower risk of induced seismicity because it's a more huff and puff system or a net closed zero voidage system of fractures, rather than constantly pumping and losing maybe 10 or 20% of the water to formation, which is what some folks are seeing at, for example, the Forge experiments at the Department of Energy in Utah test sites. So there's a lot of learning that we're getting to as a community. And at Sage, we're trying to be nimble and work with what works best. But we'll learn from all of these experiments, and we will pivot as needed. And the goal really for geothermal is to scale to what we like to call a multi-cylinder engine view of it. So on this kind of cartoon view, you have these wells I mentioned going to the subsurface with mainly vertically oriented fractures. We can keep the wells fairly close together at the surface. For example, this 20-well pad, where you cycle between injection and production in each well. In the subsurface, the wells would deviate, maybe S wells, to activate an area maybe equivalent to about 3 cubic kilometers, so much larger area for this type of 20-well system. But it gives us the ability to save costs and drill more efficiently. And this is the future, I would say, to targeting about 3 megawatts per well. Again, we haven't demonstrated this. This is what we are funded with the U.S. Air Force to begin demonstrating. We see a pathway to achieve, in our view, pretty cheap power with scale. Now, these are a little bit older numbers. We might be seeing inflation affecting them, unfortunately. But today we're a little bit more expensive than, say, gas power, but in the future we think we could be competitive, depending upon supply chain challenges and other pricing issues. So one other use case I mentioned, and this is almost my last slide, is our Meta engagement. We signed a deal with them in 2024 to provide about 8 megawatts of baseload power generation in 2027, with an option to increase that to 150 megawatts. So essentially, once you get about 100 megawatt scale, you're at the data center scale. There's a massive need for additional power across the US grid, and we are working hard to get there. We signed a virtual power purchasing agreement. So I just wanted to also acknowledge our team of supporters and collaborators. You see all the cartoon and name versions on the bottom here, but we couldn't do this alone, and significant collaboration, especially with Expand Energy, who funded our Series A, and we work very closely with the Bureau of Economic Geology in Texas, and of course NREL and others in the Department of Defense. But I'm happy to take questions, and hopefully I can answer them.
Thank you, Mike. That was really interesting. Do we have any questions out there? I wanted to ask about your close spacing. You said you were looking at like 5-foot well spacing on the power generation.
Yeah.
That seems really close.
I should have said 10 foot. Did I say 5 foot? Yeah, no. And actually, if you don't mind, I might try to open a more useful example of what it looks like in the subsurface. And I apologize, this wasn't in the initial talk, but I think it can make sense now to see it. So let me know if you can see this real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so this has a little bit better to scale images for what you're asking. So we've got the surface pad on the right. We've got a scale view on the left of the whole system. We've got the side view on the top, and we're estimating that these wells would be drilling to about 10,000 feet true vertical depth. This is a large pad system with these 10 wells. And you've got on the bottom here kind of a view of how from the surface pad in red, I mentioned we deviate the wells, and then we in place fractures near the TD.
Okay.
And we've got these two different layers of fractures. This is a bit complicated design. It doesn't have to be this complicated. It would be suited to whatever area we were drilling. But giving you a rough sense of our half-length spacing estimates and our offsets potentially, those would be subject to local investigation. I'll just say that. Like probably what we would do in this type of scenario is drill 1 or 2 initial wells, get a sense of fracture propagation, and develop them from there.
Okay, and that fracture propagation is just from the injection of the fluid. And is that kind of why you have them so close, so you get that connection of fractures between the different well bores?
That's a good question. Do we need to connect? We don't rely on connecting between well bores.
Okay.
In fact, it probably is either neutral or even a negative, like a complicating factor. If anything, I think we might try to increase the spacing of the going from more than 200 feet potentially, if we start to see interference between them. Yeah, I will say this is a very hypothetical case. We haven't built a 10 well pad yet, but this is the type of thing we will be contemplating and doing in the next 12 months in Texas. So stay tuned.
Okay. Cool. And then I think when I heard you speak last, you guys were getting ready to start a solar storage program, where you acted as the battery.
Yes.
For a solar facility. How's that progressing?
Oh, well, it's been great. This is what we're talking about. We have quite a few positive news results, I'd say, about that, in the sense that we've now been able to pump in and flow back multiple cycles at the megawatt and 2 megawatt and 3 megawatt scale with this single well. So now we're trying to test for reliability. We need to also achieve maybe 1,000-hour runtime test over the next several months in order to basically de-risk this for investors additionally. So that's kind of our next big hurdle we want to do is have more runtime.
Okay.
But we're essentially monitoring pressures, volumes, water quality, and using a very small surface pump really to prop the fracture back open when needed. That's something I didn't really mention, but after the drilling phase, the rig moves off, and then we're working with surface pumps only.
Okay. And I see you're getting a pretty good kind of return on the energy used to pump the water down versus the energy produced when you flow the water back.
Yep, that's also part of the 1,000-hour testing is to establish at different ratings of power, kind of that efficiency number, because that's critical and also critical for a business, case. So we've heard from clients that they like to see 8-hour duration. So we are testing around that frame, maybe 8 to 10 hours, in addition to like 16. Yeah, it's interesting kind of watching how this works. The goal is to be connected to the ERCOT grid also. That's in the permitting phase, I should say, still.
Cool. Anybody else have any questions? Feel free to chime in or put them in the chat or whatever is easy. Anybody?
I had a couple slides. Maybe I should try to find. I had some slides on Oklahoma
Oh,
a while back, just because there's a lot of potential for everything we're doing, really. And any place that has so much good oil and gas heritage is, you guys have de-risked so much of what we would be worried about.
yeah, I assume that kind of oil and gas area, since you have so much information on the subsurface, that's probably attractive for you.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this is where I had this, but let me try to find it.
You said you liked low permeability rock, so you really are looking at like kind of shales and tight carbonates as your main.
Yeah, that's what we've tested so far, mainly.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, and we think we see a lot of these in big chunks, say, of Arkoma Basin, as well as potentially across the Ozark uplift. It's stuff that maybe other folks would not have found very interesting for various reasons, maybe very tight, but we like that, And this is from a summit we had last year, just for fun. That's where you and I met, actually.
Yeah. Are you interested in is it helpful to have more brittle rocks so that your fractures, I suppose, are created and stay there, as opposed to more ductile rocks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we would say one way or the other yet. There are advantages and disadvantages of ductility, and one of the things we're investigating right now is kind of how in different, especially basement settings, that can be an issue. I would say, so many conditions in deep faulted environments are near critical stress. So the fact that you can alter critical stress states with less than 500 psi variances is very concerning, I would say, to anybody who's doing operations at depth. And so we are modeling very closely that question you're asking, because there's far field effects that would be felt by injection in very brittle facies, I would say, more so, maybe less so than in more ductile facies. And so, but there may be advantages too to initial fracture propagation when you create and construct your system. So frankly, stay tuned. We'll learn more as we operate more places. But I think for now, we have a bias to testing in sedimentary rock because of the ductile kind of envelope that we see, and especially in the mudstones.
Okay. Cool. No, this is really interesting. I'm kind of excited to see both the battery use and the generation use and see how it progresses. So.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, hopefully we'll make a difference and maybe get on the market. I think Neighbors is hoping that our efforts will lead to a more stable business line for them rather than the boom bust of oil and gas. So they'll be able to drill more continuously, hopefully.
Okay.
That's the long-term vision.
Okay. Very cool. Well, thank you again for spending your time and joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We have been recording, so we will publish this probably in a day or two to our YouTube channel, and people will be able to view it there. So again, I appreciate your time and look forward to seeing more projects by Sage.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your questions.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.